delimitation of maritime boundaries in the areas under dispute shall be agreed between the two coastal states on the basis of international law." End of quote. The court observes that Kenya's 2009 submission to the CLCS also alludes to the lack of agreement between the parties on the maritime boundary in the exclusive economic zone. In respect of the boundary with Tanzania, the submission explains that an agreement is in place between Kenya and Tanzania concerning the delimitation of maritime boundaries. However, in respect of the boundary with Somalia, the submission states that the exclusive economic zone boundary, I quote, "shall be delimited by notice in the Gazette by the Minister pursuant to an agreement between Kenya and Somalia on the basis of international law." End of quote. Thus employing the same terms as Section 4, Subsection 4 of the 1989 Maritime Zones Act. The submission also notes the existence of an unsettled boundary line between Kenya and Somalia. From these terms, it was reasonable for Somalia to maintain its understanding that an agreement had yet to be negotiated and concluded. On 26 and 27 March 2014, at the request of the Kenyan government, the parties met in Nairobi to engage in negotiations on maritime delimitation. The mere fact that these negotiations took place suggests that the parties recognized the need to delimit the maritime boundary between them. This is confirmed by the parties' joint report on the negotiations, which states that they considered several options and methods, including bisector, perpendicular, median, and parallel of latitude, but that they could not reach a consensus on the potential maritime boundary line acceptable to both countries to be adopted. Nowhere does the report imply that there already was an agreed maritime boundary between the parties. Finally, the court observes that Kenya's recognition that no agreement on the maritime boundary with Somalia had been reached was also reflected in its two notes verbal to the Secretary General from the Permanent Mission of Kenya to the United Nations, dated 24 October 2014 and 4 May 2015, and in its statements made to the court during the preliminary objection phase of this case. In light of the foregoing, the court concludes that Kenya has not consistently maintained its claim that the parallel of latitude constitutes a single maritime boundary with Somalia. Kenya's claim was contradicted by its Territorial Waters Act of 1972, which remained in force in 1979, its 1989 Maritime Zones Act, and its 2009 submission to the CLCS. Under these circumstances, it was reasonable for Somalia to understand that its maritime boundary with Kenya in the territorial sea, in the exclusive economic zone, and on the continental shelf would be established by agreement to be negotiated and concluded in the future. The court thus concludes that there is no compelling evidence that Kenya's claim and related conduct were consistently maintained and consequently called for a response from Somalia. The court then recalls that Kenya's claim of acquiescence is based on Somalia's alleged acceptance of a maritime boundary at the parallel of latitude, in particular through its prolonged absence of protests. The court addresses this argument of Kenya, bearing in mind the conclusion just mentioned. It notes in particular that in the years immediately following Kenya's 1979 proclamation, the parties engaged in discussions on a variety of issues relating to their bilateral relations, such as trade and exploitation of marine resources. However, there is no indication that Somalia accepted Kenya's claim to a boundary along a parallel of latitude during that period. In this regard, Kenya has submitted minutes of a meeting held between the vice presidents of the two states on 6 May 1980. But these minutes make no mention of any discussion of the parties' maritime boundaries or the 1979 proclamation. The same is true of other evidence submitted by Kenya in relation to meetings held by the parties in 1981. Until 1989, Somalia did not claim an exclusive economic zone or define its continental shelf. Shortly before ratifying UNCLOS, Somalia adopted the Maritime Law of 1988, approved by Law No. 5 on 26 January 1989. The Maritime Law does not refer to the delimitation of either the exclusive economic zone or the continental shelf. Article 4 defines Somalia's territorial sea as extending to 12 nautical miles and addresses the issue of its delimitation with Kenya, providing in the relevant part of paragraph 6, I quote, "If there is no multilateral treaty, the Somali Democratic Republic shall consider that the border between the Somali Democratic Republic and the Republic of Djibouti and the Republic of Kenya is a straight line towards the sea from the land as indicated on the enclosed charts." End of quote. Somalia has not produced the charts mentioned in the provision, explaining that they may have been lost or destroyed during the Civil War. It maintains that the phrase "straight line towards the sea" was intended to be equivalent to an equidistance line. Kenya contends that although the meaning of the phrase is unclear, taking Somalia's contemporary practice into account, it should be interpreted as a reference to the parallel of latitude. The court notes that Article 4, Paragraph 6 of the Maritime Law also refers to the delimitation of maritime areas in relation to the Republic of Yemen, employing the phrase "a median line." The phrase "a straight line towards the sea" is not clear, and without the charts mentioned, its meaning cannot be determined. Somalia did not react immediately to the 2005 proclamation. However, its view was made clear on several occasions in 2009. As noted earlier, the MOU concluded that year between the parties referred to an unsettled maritime dispute. Somalia's 2009 submission of preliminary information to the CLCS reproduces the text of the MOU and indicates that unresolved questions remain in relation to the bilateral delimitation of the continental shelf with neighboring states. In addition, in a letter dated 19 August 2009 and addressed to the Secretary General of the United Nations, the Prime Minister of Somalia maintained that the delimitation of the continental shelf has not yet been settled, further stating that, I quote, "It would appear that Kenya claims an area extending up to the latitude of the point where the land border reaches the coast, while instead, in accordance with the international law of the sea, an equidistance line normally constitutes the point of departure for the delimitation of continental shelf between the two states with adjacent coasts. Somalia bases itself on the latter view." End of quote. Further, as noted by the court in the 2017 judgment, in 2014, Somalia objected to the consideration by the CLCS of Kenya's submission on the ground that there existed a maritime boundary dispute between itself and Kenya. Somalia withdrew its objection in 2015, noting that the dispute had been submitted to the court. Finally, the court cannot ignore the context of the civil war that afflicted Somalia, depriving it of a fully operational government and administration between 1991 and 2005. These circumstances were public and notorious, and they were also recognized by Kenya in the previous phase of the proceedings. This context needs to be taken into account in evaluating the extent to which Somalia was in a position to react to Kenya's claim during this period. For the foregoing reasons, the court considers that the conduct of Somalia between 1979 and 2014 in relation to its maritime boundary with Kenya, as just examined, in particular its alleged absence of protest against Kenya's claim, does not establish Somalia's clear and consistent acceptance of a maritime boundary at the parallel of latitude. The court then examines Kenya's argument that other conduct of the parties between 1979 and 2014, in particular their practice concerning naval patrols, fisheries, marine scientific research, and oil concessions, confirms Somalia's acceptance of a maritime boundary at the parallel of latitude. The court recalls that in the context of a maritime delimitation dispute, as for territorial disputes, the date on which the dispute crystallized is of significance. Acts occurring after such date are in principle irrelevant to the determination of a maritime boundary and cannot be taken into account, having been carried out by a state which, already having claims to assert an illegal dispute, could have taken those actions strictly with the aim of buttressing those claims. The court recalls that the MOU concluded by the parties in 2009 and Kenya's 2009 submission to the CLCS indicate that a maritime dispute existed between them as of 2009. Somalia has not provided the court with sufficient evidence to conclude that the dispute emerged before 2009. Accordingly, the court considers that the parties' activities after 2009 cannot be taken into account for the purpose of determining the maritime boundary. The court begins by considering the evidence of naval patrols. Maps depicting and logs recording Kenya's naval patrols and interceptions in the territorial sea show that some law enforcement activities were conducted by Kenya north of the equidistance line claimed by Somalia. Occasionally, however, there were also conducted north of the parallel of latitude that it claims as the maritime boundary. Kenya's naval patrols and interceptions were thus not necessarily consistent with its maritime boundary claim. Moreover, One of the maps submitted by Kenya is marked secret, and the remaining evidence does not establish that Somalia had knowledge of these activities. For the reasons given in the judgment, the court considers that the evidence on fisheries and marine scientific research activities also does not support Kenya's claim. As regards oil concessions, the court notes that the parties have established offshore oil concession blocks employing different lines since the 1970s. However, the parties have referred only to limited practice that took place before 2009. For the most part, the parties have referred to practice after 2009, which, for the reasons previously explained, is irrelevant to the determination of the maritime boundary. The court notes Kenya's argument that the conduct of the parties, including with respect to oil concessions, reflects the existence of a de facto maritime boundary. Even assuming that the limited evidence of practice before 2009 could be taken to suggest that a de facto line along the parallel of latitude may have been used by the parties for the location of oil concession blocks, at least for some time, the court observes that this may have been simply the manifestation of caution exercised by the parties in grand purpose, such as sharing a scarce resource. The court considers that proof of the existence of a maritime boundary requires more than the demonstration of longstanding oil practice or adjoining oil concessions. For these reasons, the court considers that other conduct of the parties between 1979 and 2014 does not confirm that Somalia has clearly and consistently accepted a maritime boundary at the parallel of latitude. In conclusion, the court finds that there is no compelling evidence that Somalia has acquiesced to the maritime boundary claimed by Kenya, and that consequently, there is no agreed maritime boundary between the parties at the parallel of latitude. Kenya's claim in this respect must therefore be rejected. In view of the conclusion just stated, the court turns to the delimitation of the maritime areas appertaining to Somalia and Kenya. In its application, Somalia requested the court to determine on the basis of international law the complete course of the single maritime boundary dividing all the maritime areas appertaining to Somalia and to Kenya in the Indian Ocean, including the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles. Both Somalia and Kenya are parties to UNCLOS. The provisions of the convention must therefore be applied by the court in determining the course of the maritime boundary between the two states. The court begins by identifying the starting point of the maritime boundary. Although the parties initially preferred divergent views on the appropriate approach to defining the starting point to the maritime boundary, those views evolved in the course of the proceedings and are now, by and large, concordant. Taking into account the views of the parties, the court considers that the starting point of the maritime boundary is to be determined by connecting the final permanent beacon of the parties' land boundary, known as primary beacon number 29 or PB29, to a point on the low water line by a straight line that runs in a southeasterly direction and is perpendicular to the general trend of the coastline at Dar es Salaam, in accordance with the terms of the 1927-1933 treaty arrangement. The starting point is illustrated on sketch map number 3 in the judgment. The court next addresses the delimitation of the territorial sea. It notes that Somalia submits that the delimitation of the territorial sea is to be effected pursuant to Article 15 of the Convention, whereas Kenya argues that the maritime boundary, including the part in the territorial sea, already exists and that it follows the parallel of latitude. The court has already concluded that no such boundary was agreed by the parties. The court also notes that Kenya, in its counter-memorial, referred to the 1927-1933 treaty arrangement and stated that it, I quote, provided for the establishment of a boundary in the territorial sea, end of quote. The court notes that neither party asks it to confirm the existence of any segment of the maritime boundary or to delimit the boundary in the territorial sea on the basis of the 1927-1933 treaty arrangement. It recalls that in their legislation concerning the territorial sea, neither party has referred to the terms of the 1927-1933 treaty arrangement to indicate the extent of the territorial sea in relation to its adjacent neighbor. Kenya's legislation has referred to a median or equidistance line, and Somalia's maritime law of 1988 refers to a straight line towards the sea from the land as indicated on the enclosed charts. The court further notes that the agenda of the meeting between Somalia and Kenya, held on 26 and 27 March 2014, to discuss the maritime boundary between the two countries, covered all maritime zones, including the territorial sea. The delegations discussed several options and methods for determining the maritime boundary, although they could not reach agreement. In a presentation examining an equity-based maritime boundary scenario, which is attached to the joint report on that meeting, Kenya referred to Articles 15, 74, and 83 of the Convention as relevant to the maritime delimitation. It emphasized that Article 15 provides for a delimitation through a median line for the territorial sea, unless there is agreement to the contrary based on a claim by historic title or special circumstances. The Court therefore considers it unnecessary to decide whether the 1927-1933 treaty arrangement had as an objective the delimitation of the boundary of the territorial sea. The Court then recalls that the delimitation methodology is based on the geography of the coast of the two states concerned, and that a median or equidistance line is constructed using base points appropriate to that geography. Although in the identification of base points the Court will have regard to the proposals of the parties, it need not select a particular base point, even if the parties are in agreement thereon, if it does not consider that base point to be appropriate. The Court may select a base point that neither party has proposed. The Court further recalls that it has sometimes been led to eliminate the disproportionate effect of small islands by not selecting a base point on such small maritime features. As the Court has stated in the past, there may be situations in which the equitableness of an equidistance line depends on whether precaution is taken of eliminating the disproportionate effect of certain islets, rocks, or minor coastal projections. In the circumstances of the present case, the Court considers it appropriate to place base points for the construction of the median line solely on solid land on the mainland coast of the parties. It does not consider it appropriate to place base points on the tiny arid Dacwadda islets, which would have a disproportionate impact on the course of the median line in comparison to the size of these features. For similar reasons, the Court does not consider it appropriate to select a base point on a low tide elevation off the southern tip of Ras Kamboni, which is a minor protuberance in Soomaliya's otherwise relatively straight coastline in the vicinity of the land boundary terminus, which constitutes the starting point of the maritime delimitation. The Court then provides the geographical coordinates of the appropriate base points selected on the parties' coasts used to construct the median line. The resulting line starts from the land boundary terminus and continues to the point A, at the distance of 12 nautical miles from the coast. That median line is depicted on sketch map number 5, now shown on the screen. The Court observes that the course of that median line corresponds closely to the course of a line at right angles to the general trend of the coastline, assuming that the 1927-1933 treaty arrangement, in using this phrase, had as an objective to draw a line that continues into the territorial sea, a question that the Court need not decide. The Court then proceeds to the delimitation of the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf within 200 nautical miles from the coast of the parties. The relevant provisions of the Convention for this exercise are contained in Article 74 of UNCLOS for the delimitation of the exclusive economic zone and Article 83 for the delimitation of the continental shelf. These provisions are of a very general nature and do not provide much by way of guidance for those involved in maritime delimitation exercise. The goal of that exercise is the achievement of an equitable solution. If two states have freely agreed on a maritime boundary, they are deemed to have achieved such an equitable solution. However, if they fail to reach agreement on their maritime boundary and the matter is submitted to the Court, it is the task of the Court to find an equitable solution in the maritime delimitation it has been requested to effect. Since the adoption of the Convention, the Court has gradually developed a maritime delimitation methodology to assist it in carrying out its task. In determining the maritime delimitation line, the Court proceeds in three stages, which it described in the case concerning maritime delimitation in the Black Sea, Romania versus Ukraine. In the first stage, the Court will establish the provisional equidistance line from the most appropriate base points on the coast of the parties. The Court will, in the second stage, consider whether there are factors calling for the adjustment or shifting of the provisional equidistance line in order to achieve an equitable result. In the third and final stage, the Court will submit the envisaged delimitation line either the equidistance line or the adjusted line, to the disproportionality test. The purpose of this test is to assure the court that there is no marked disproportion between the ratio of the lengths of the relevant coasts of the parties and the ratio of their respective shares of the parties in the relevant area to be delimited by the envisaged line, and thus to confirm that the delimitation achieves an equitable solution as required by the Convention. The Court observes that the three-stage methodology is not prescribed by the Convention and therefore is not mandatory. It has been developed by the Court in its jurisprudence on maritime delimitation as part of its effort to arrive at an equitable solution as required by Articles 74 and 83 of the Convention. The methodology is based on objective geographical criteria, while at the same time taking into account any relevant circumstances bearing on the equitableness of the maritime boundary. It has brought predictability to the process of maritime delimitation and has been applied by the Court in a number of past cases. The three-stage methodology for maritime delimitation has also been used by international tribunals. The Court will not use the three-stage methodology if there are factors which make the application of the equidistance method inappropriate. For instance, if the construction of an equidistance line from the coast is not feasible. This, however, is not the case in the present circumstances, where such a line can be constructed. Moreover, the Court does not consider the use of a parallel of latitude as the appropriate methodology to achieve an equitable solution as suggested by Kenya. A boundary along the parallel of latitude would produce a severe cutoff effect on the maritime projections of the southernmost coast of Somalia. The Court therefore sees no reason in the present case to depart from its usual practice of using the three-stage methodology to establish the maritime boundary between Somalia and Kenya in the exclusive economic zone and on the continental shelf. The Court first identifies the relevant coasts of the parties, namely those coasts whose projections overlap. The Court, using radial projections which overlap within 200 nautical miles, has identified that the relevant coast of Somalia extends for approximately 733 kilometers and that of Kenya for approximately 511 kilometers. The Court notes that the parties disagree as to the identification of the relevant area. The Court has explained on a number of occasions that the relevant area comprises that part of the maritime space in which the potential entitlements of the parties overlap. The Court also recalls its observation that the relevant area cannot extend beyond the area in which the entitlements of both parties overlap. The Court is of the view that in the north, the relevant area extends as far as the overlap of the maritime projections of the coast of Kenya and the coast of Somalia. The Court considers it appropriate to use the overlap of the 200 nautical mile radial projections from the land boundary terminus. As far as the southern limit of the relevant area is concerned, the Court notes that the parties agree that the maritime space south of the boundary that Kenya and Tanzania, south of the boundary between Kenya and Tanzania, is not part of the relevant area. The relevant area, as identified by the Court for the purpose of delimiting the exclusive economic zone and continental shelf up to 200 nautical miles from the coast, measures approximately 212,844 square kilometers. The Court next constructs the provisional equidistance line. It first identifies the base points it considers appropriate for the construction of the provisional equidistance line within 200 nautical miles of the coasts. The provisional equidistance line is constructed on the basis of these base points, and it begins from the endpoint of the maritime boundary in the territorial sea, point A, and continues until it reaches 200 nautical miles from the starting point of the maritime boundary, at a point with the coordinates indicated in the judgment. The resulting line is depicted on sketch map 9, which is now shown on the screen. The Court next considers whether there are factors requiring the adjustment or shifting of the provisional equidistance line in order to achieve an equitable solution. The Court recalls that Kenya perceives the provisional equidistance line as inequitable, while Somalia does not see any plausible reason for adjusting the line and believes that it would constitute an equitable boundary. The Court notes that Kenya, by invoking various factors which it considers as constituting relevant circumstances in the context of this case, has consistently sought a maritime boundary that would follow the parallel of latitude. The Court has already concluded that no maritime boundary between Somalia and Kenya following the parallel of latitude was established in the past. Nor has the Court accepted the methodology based on the parallel of latitude for establishing the maritime boundary between the parties as advocated by Kenya. Kenya would now like to achieve the same result by a major shifting of the provisional equidistance line, changing its southeasterly direction to an exclusively easterly direction. The court considers that such a shifting of the provisional equidistance line, as argued for by Kenya, would result in a radical adjustment while clearly not achieving an equitable solution. It would severely curtail Somalia's entitlements to the continental shelf and exclusive economic zone generated by its coast adjacent to that of Kenya. A line thus adjusted would not allow the coast of the parties to produce their effects in terms of maritime entitlements in a reasonable and mutually balanced way. The court begins by considering those factors relied on by Kenya, which are of a non-geographical nature. As far as the security interests of Kenya are concerned, the court is fully aware of and does not underestimate the serious threats to security in the region. These threats are certainly of legitimate concern to the states of the region and to the international community at large. The court notes the efforts of the international community, in particular the United Nations and the African Union, as well as of various countries including Kenya, to assist Somalia in reestablishing peace and security after many years of internal conflicts. The court observes that boundaries between states, including maritime boundaries, are aimed at providing permanency and stability. That being so, the court believes that the current security situation in Somalia and the maritime spaces adjacent to its coast is not of a permanent nature. The court is therefore not of the view that the current security situation justifies an adjustment of the provisional equidistance line. Moreover, the court recalls its statement in a previous case that legitimate security considerations may be a relevant circumstance if a maritime delimitation was effected particularly near the coast of a state. This is not the case here, as the provisional equidistance line does not pass near the coast of Kenya. The court also recalls that control over the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf is not normally associated with security considerations and does not affect the rights of navigation. Access for Kenya's fisherfolk to natural resources is another factor which Kenya brings to the attention of the court when arguing for the adjustment of the line. Such a factor can be taken into account by the court as a relevant circumstance in exceptional cases, in particular if the line would likely entail catastrophic repercussions for the livelihood and economic well-being of the population of the countries concerned. On the basis of the evidence before it, the court is not convinced that the provisional equidistance line would entail such harsh consequences for the population of Kenya in the present case. In any event, as it appears from a map provided by Kenya, 17 out of 19 fish landing sites are located near or at the Lamu archipelago and would therefore be unaffected by an equidistance line. Only 2 landing sites are close to the land boundary terminus. Moreover, in the present case, the court has to consider the well-being of the populations on both sides of the delimitation line. In light of the foregoing, the court cannot accept Kenya's argument that a provisional equidistance line would deny Kenya equitable access to fisheries resources that are vital to its population. The court then turns to Kenya's argument that the party's long-standing and consistent conduct in relation to oil concessions, naval patrols, fishing, and other activities reflects the existence of a de facto maritime boundary along the parallel of latitude, which calls for adjustment of the provisional equidistance line. The court has already concluded that no maritime boundary along the parallel of latitude has been agreed by the parties. There is no de facto maritime boundary between Somalia and Kenya. The court therefore cannot accept the argument of Kenya that, on the basis of conduct of the parties, the provisional equidistance line has to be adjusted so that it coincides with the alleged de facto maritime boundary. The court next considers the 2 remaining arguments that, according to Kenya, call for adjustment of the provisional equidistance line. Kenya submits that the application of an equidistance line would produce a significant cutoff effect with respect to its maritime areas. It also points out that the cutoff effect produced by the equidistance line is severely exacerbated past the 200 nautical mile limit, essentially to the point that Kenya would be completely cut off from the outer limit of the continental shelf. Kenya further argues that the regional context and practice require the adjustment of the provisional equidistance line. The court and international tribunals have acknowledged that the use of the equidistance line can produce a cutoff effect, particularly where the coastline is characterized by concavity. In 1985, the court reaffirmed that an equidistance line may yield a disproportionate result where a coast is markedly concave or convex. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, while stating that in the delimitation of exclusive economic zone and continental shelf concavity is not necessarily a relevant circumstance, has also confirmed that when an equidistance line drawn between two states produces a cutoff effect on the maritime entitlement of one of the two states as a result of the concavity of the coast, then an adjustment of that line may be necessary in order to reach an equitable result. The Court considers that any cutoff effect as a result of the Kenya maritime boundary is not a relevant circumstance. The agreements between Kenya and Tanzania are res inter aelios actos. They cannot per se affect the maritime boundary between Kenya and Somalia. However, the issue to be considered in the present case is whether the use of an equidistance line produces a cutoff effect for Kenya not as a result of the agreed boundary between Kenya and Tanzania, but as a result of the configuration of the coastline. If the examination of the coastline is limited only to the coasts of Kenya and Somalia, any concavity is not conspicuous. However, by examining only the coastlines of the two states concerned to assess the extent of any cutoff effect resulting from the geographic configuration of the coastline may be an overly narrow approach. Examining the concavity of the coastline in a broader geographical configuration is consistent with the approach taken by this Court and international tribunals. In the two North Sea continental shelf cases, the Court examined the coasts of 3 states with Germany in the middle. The Court did so in the context of proceedings that had been joined, although the cases themselves remained separate. The Court noted that although 2 separate delimitations were in question, they involved, indeed actually gave rise to, a single situation. The Court emphasized that the fact that the question of either of these delimitations might have arisen and called for settlement separately in point of time does not alter the character of the problem with which the Court is actually faced. In both the Bangladesh-Myanmar and Bangladesh versus India cases, even though the issue was that of a boundary between the 2 respective states, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in the former case and the Arbitral Tribunal in the latter each looked at the concavity of the coast of the 3 states as a whole, with Bangladesh in the middle. In the present case, the potential cutoff of Kenya's maritime entitlements should be assessed in a broader geographical context. The potential cutoff of Kenya's maritime entitlements cannot be properly observed by examining the coasts of Kenya and Somalia in isolation. When the mainland coasts of Somalia, Kenya, and Tanzania are observed together as a whole, the coastline is undoubtedly concave. Kenya faces a cutoff of its maritime entitlements as the middle state located between Somalia and Tanzania. The presence of Pemba Island, a large and populated island that appertains to Tanzania, accentuates this cutoff effect because of its influence on the course of a hypothetical equidistance line between Kenya and Tanzania, as shown by sketch map number 10, now appearing on the screen. The provisional equidistance line between Somalia and Kenya progressively narrows the coastal projection of Kenya, substantially reducing its maritime entitlements within 200 nautical miles. This cutoff effect occurs as a result of the configuration of the coastline extending from Somalia to Tanzania, independently of the boundary line agreed between Kenya and Tanzania, which in fact mitigates that effect in the south, in the exclusive economic zone and on the continental shelf up to 200 nautical miles. The Court recalls its jurisprudence and that of international tribunals, according to which an adjustment of the provisional equidistance line is warranted if the cutoff effect is serious or significant. In the view of the Court, even though the cutoff effect in the present case is less pronounced than in some other cases, it is nonetheless still serious enough to warrant some adjustment to address the substantial narrowing of Kenya's potential entitlements. The Court has affirmed that the achievement of an equitable solution requires that, so far as possible, the line of delimitation should allow the coasts of the parties to produce their effects in terms of maritime entitlements in a reasonable and mutually balanced way. This is an important standard to be used in making an adjustment to the provisional equidistance line. The Court, however, bears in mind the following principles. There is no question of refashioning geography or compensating for the inequalities of nature. Equity does not necessarily apply equality, and there can be no question of distributive justice. In other words, an adjustment should not produce an unreasonable result for Somalia. In order to attenuate the cutoff effect described earlier, the Court considers it reasonable to adjust the provisional equidistance line. In view of the above considerations, the Court believes that it is necessary to shift the line to the north so that from point A it follows a geodetic line with an initial azimuth of 114 degrees. This line would attenuate in a reasonable and mutually balanced way the cutoff effect produced by the unadjusted equidistance line due to the geographic configuration of the coasts of Somalia, Kenya, and Tanzania. The resulting line would end at its intersection with the 200 nautical mile limit from the coast of Kenya at a point B, with the coordinates indicated in paragraph 174 of the judgment. The adjusted line is depicted in sketch map number 11, now appearing on screen. In the final stage, the Court checks whether the envisaged delimitation line leads to a significant disproportionality between the ratio of the lengths of the parties' respective relevant coasts and the ratio of the size of the relevant area apportioned by the line. As mentioned earlier, the relevant coast of Somalia is 733 kilometers, and that of Kenya is 511 kilometers long. The ratio of the relevant coasts is 1 to 1.43 in favor of Somalia. The maritime boundary determined by the Court divides the relevant area within 200 nautical miles of the coast in such a way that approximately 120,455 square kilometers would appertain to Kenya, and the remaining part, measuring approximately 92,389 square kilometers, would appertain to Somalia. The ratio between the maritime zones that would appertain respectively to Kenya and Somalia is 1 to 1.3 in favor of Kenya. A comparison of these two ratios does not reveal any significant or marked disproportionality. The Court is thus satisfied that the adjusted line that it has established as the maritime boundary for the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelves of Somalia and Kenya within 200 nautical miles in the Indian Ocean described earlier achieves an equitable solution as required by Article 74, Paragraph 1 and Article 83, Paragraph 1 of the Convention. The Court finally turns to the question of the delimitation of the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles. It is recalled that both parties have asked the Court to determine the complete course of the maritime boundary between them, including the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles. The Court recalls that any claim of continental shelf rights beyond 200 nautical miles by a state party to UNCLOS must be in accordance with Article 76 of UNCLOS and reviewed by the Commission on the limits of the continental shelf established thereunder. The Court observes that both states have made submissions on the limits of the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles to the Commission in accordance with Article 76, Paragraph 8 of the Convention. The Court notes that both Somalia and Kenya have fulfilled their obligations under Article 76 of the Convention. At the same time, the Commission has yet to consider these submissions and make any recommendations to Somalia and Kenya on matters related to the establishment of the outer limits of their continental shelves. It is only after such recommendations are made that Somalia and Kenya can establish final and binding outer limits of their continental shelves in accordance with Article 76, Paragraph 8 of UNCLOS. The Court emphasizes that the lack of delineation of the outer limit of the continental shelf is not, in and of itself, an impediment to the delimitation between two states with adjacent coasts, as is the case here. The Court observes that the entitlement of the parties to the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles are to be determined by reference to the outer limit of the continental margin, to be ascertained in accordance with Article 76, Paragraphs 4 and 5 of UNCLOS. The entitlement of a state to the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles depends on geological and geomorphological criteria subject to the constraints set out in Article 76, Paragraph 5. An essential step in any delimitation is to determine whether there are entitlements and whether they overlap. The situation in the present case is not the same as that addressed by the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in the Bangladesh-Myanmar case. In that case, the unique situation of the Bay of Bengal and the negotiation record at the Third United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, which threw particular light on the parties' contentions on the subject, were sufficient to enable the tribunal to proceed with the delimitation of the area beyond 200 nautical miles. The Court notes that in their submissions to the Commission, both Somalia and Kenya claim on the basis of scientific evidence a continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles, and that their claims overlap. In most of the area of overlapping claims beyond 200 nautical miles, both parties claim that their continental shelf extends to the maximum distance of 350 nautical miles. The Court further notes that neither party questions the existence of the other party's entitlement to a continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles or the extent of that claim. Their dispute concerns the boundary delimiting the shelf between them. Both parties in their submissions, Somalia in those presented at the close of the hearings and Kenya in its rejoinder, request the Court to delimit the maritime boundary between them in the Indian Ocean up to the outer limit of the continental shelf. For the reasons just set out, the Court proceeds to do so. As regards the relevant circumstances invoked by Kenya for adjustment of the provisional equidistance line, the Court has already considered them earlier and adjusted the line accordingly in the exclusive economic zone and on the continental shelf up to 200 nautical miles. The Court recalls that both Somalia and Kenya have claimed a continental shelf extending up to 350 nautical miles in the greater part of the area of overlapping claims. In view of the foregoing, the Court considers it appropriate to extend the geodetic line used for the delimitation of the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf within 200 nautical miles to delimit the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles. The Court therefore concludes that the maritime boundary beyond 200 nautical miles continues along the same geodetic line as the adjusted line within 200 nautical miles until it reaches the outer limit of the parties' continental shelves, which are to be delineated by Somalia and Kenya respectively on the basis of the recommendations to be made by the Commission, or until it reaches the area where the rights of third states may be affected. The direction of that line is depicted on sketchmap number 12, now appearing on the screen. Depending on the extent of Kenya's entitlement to a continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles, as it may be established in the future on the basis of the Commission's recommendation, the delimitation line might give rise to an area of limited size located beyond 200 nautical miles from the coast of Kenya and within 200 nautical miles from the coast of Somalia, but on the Kenyan side of the delimitation line. This possible gray area is depicted on sketchmap number 12. Since the existence of this gray area is only a possibility, the Court does not consider it necessary in the circumstances of the present case to pronounce itself on a legal regime that would be applicable in that area. The complete course of the maritime boundary is shown on sketchmap number 13, now appearing on the screen. In its final submissions, Somalia also requests the Court to adjudge and declare that Kenya, by its conduct in the disputed area, has violated its international obligations and is responsible under international law to make full reparation to Somalia. Somalia, however, stated during the oral proceedings that it does not insist on compensation for past violations. It asks the Court to order Kenya to cease its wrongful acts and to make available to Somalia the technical data acquired in areas that are determined by the Court to be subject to the sovereignty or sovereign rights and jurisdiction of Somalia. The Court first examines the applicant's argument that by its unilateral actions in the disputed area, Kenya has violated Somalia's sovereignty over its territorial sea and its sovereign rights and jurisdiction in the exclusive economic zone and on the continental shelf. The Court recalls that Somalia's submission is made in the context of proceedings regarding a maritime boundary which has not been settled prior to the decision of the Court. The consequence of the Court's judgment is that the maritime boundary has now been delimited between the parties. The Court considers that when maritime claims of states overlap, maritime activities undertaken by a state in an area which is subsequently attributed to another state by a judgment cannot be considered to be in violation of the sovereign rights of the latter if those activities were taken before the judgment was delivered and if the area concerned was the subject of claims made in good faith by both states. Somalia complains of surveying and drilling activity conducted or authorized by Kenya in an area located entirely or partially north of the equidistance line claimed by Somalia as the maritime boundary. There is no evidence that Kenya's claims over the area were not made in good faith. Under the circumstances, the court concludes that it has not been established that Kenya's maritime activities, including those that may have been conducted in parts of the disputed area that have now been attributed to Somalia, were in violation of Somalia's sovereignty or its sovereign rights and jurisdiction. The court then turns to the applicant's argument that Kenya's activities were in violation of Article 74, Paragraph 3 and Article 83, Paragraph 3 of UNCLOS. Under those provisions, states with opposite or adjacent coasts that have not reached an agreement on the delimitation of the exclusive economic zone or continental shelf are under an obligation to make every effort during this transitional period not to jeopardize or hamper the reaching of a final agreement. The court considers that the transitional period mentioned in those provisions refers to the period after the maritime delimitation dispute has been established until a final delimitation by agreement or adjudication has been achieved. As previously noted, the court is of the view that a maritime delimitation dispute between the parties has been established since 2009. Accordingly, the court only examines whether the activities conducted by Kenya after 2009 jeopardized or hampered the reaching of a final agreement on the delimitation of the maritime boundary. The court observes that Somalia complains of certain activities, including the award of oil concession blocks to private operators and the performance of seismic and other surveys in those blocks, which are of a transitory character. These activities are not of the kind that could lead to permanent physical change in the marine environment, and it has not been established that they had the effect of jeopardizing or hampering the reaching of a final agreement on the delimitation of the maritime boundary. Somalia also complains of certain drilling activities, which are of the kind that could lead to permanent physical change in the marine environment. Such activities may alter the status quo between parties to a maritime dispute and could jeopardize or hamper the reaching of a final agreement. However, the court concludes that on the basis of the evidence before it, it is not in a position to determine with sufficient certainty that drilling operations that could have led to a permanent physical change in the disputed area took place after 2009. The court further notes that in 2014, the parties engaged in negotiations on maritime delimitation and that in 2016, Kenya suspended its activities in the disputed area and offered to enter into provisional arrangements with Somalia. In light of these circumstances, the court cannot conclude that the activities carried out by Kenya in the disputed area jeopardized or hampered the reaching of a final agreement on the delimitation of the maritime boundary in violation of Article 74, Paragraph 3 or Article 83, Paragraph 3 of UNCLOS. For these reasons, the court finds that Kenya has not violated its international obligations through its maritime activities in the disputed area. Since Kenya's international responsibility is not engaged, the court need not examine Somalia's request for reparation. Somalia's submission must therefore be rejected. The maritime boundary between the parties having been determined, the court expects that each party will fully respect the sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction of the other in accordance with international law. I shall now read out the operative part of the judgment. For these reasons, the court, 1, unanimously finds that there is no agreed maritime boundary between the Federal Republic of Somalia and the Republic of Kenya that follows the parallel of latitude described in paragraph 35 above. 2, unanimously decides that the starting point of the single maritime boundary delimiting the respective maritime areas between the Federal Republic of Somalia and the Republic of Kenya is the intersection of the straight line extending from the final permanent boundary beacon, PB29, at right angles to the general direction of the coast with the low water line, at the point with coordinates 1 degree, 39 minutes, 44 seconds south, and 41 degrees, 33 minutes, 34.4 seconds east, WGS 84. 3, unanimously decides that from the starting point, the maritime boundary in the territorial sea follows the median line described at paragraph 117 above until it reaches the 12 nautical mile limit at the point with coordinates 1 degree, 47 minutes, 39.1 seconds south, and 41 degree, 43 minutes, 46.8 seconds east, WGS 84. Point A. 4, by 10 votes to 4, decides that from the end of the boundary in the territorial sea, point A, the single maritime boundary delimiting the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf up to 200 nautical miles between the Federal Republic of Somalia and the Republic of Kenya follows the geodetic line starting with azimuth 114 degrees until it reaches the 200 nautical mile limit, measured from the baselines from which the breadth of the territorial sea of the Republic of Kenya is measured, at the point with coordinates 3 degrees, 4 minutes, 21.3 seconds south, and 44 degrees, 35 minutes, 30.7 seconds east, WSG 84. Point B. In favor, President Donahue, Vice President Gevorgian, Judges Tomka, Benuna, Shwe, Sebutinde, Robinson, Iwasawa, Nolte, Judge Ad hoc Guillaume. Against, Judges Abraham, Yusuf, Bandari, Salam. 5. By 9 votes to 5, decides that from point B, the maritime boundary delimiting the continental shelf continues along the same geodetic line until it reaches the outer limits of the continental shelf or the area where the rights of third states may be affected. In favor, President Donahue, Vice President Gevorgian, Judges Tomka, Benuna, Shwe, Sebutinde, Iwasawa, Nolte, Judge Ad hoc Guillaume. Against, Judges Abraham, Yusuf, Bandari, Robinson, Salam. 6. Unanimously rejects the claim by the Federal Republic of Somalia on its final submission number 4. I now call upon the registrar to read the operative part of the judgment in French.
Par ces motifs, la Cour 1. À l'unanimité, dit qu'il n'existe pas de frontière maritime convenue entre la République fédérale de Somalie et la République du Kenya, longeant le parallèle décrit au paragraphe 35 ci-dessus. 2. À l'unanimité, décide que le point de départ de la frontière maritime unique, délimitant les espaces maritimes respectifs de la République fédérale de Somalie et de la République du Kenya, est situé à l'intersection de la ligne droite partant de la dernière borne frontière permanente, PP 29, à angle droit de la direction générale de la côte avec la laisse de basse mer au point de coordonnées 1 degré 39 minutes 44 secondes de latitude sud et 41 degrés 33 minutes 34 secondes,4 de longitude est, WGS 84. 3. À l'unanimité, décide que, à partir du point de départ, la frontière maritime dans la mer territoriale suit la ligne médiane, décrite au paragraphe 117 ci-dessus, jusqu'à ce qu'elle atteigne la limite des 12 000 marins, au point situé par 1 degré 47 minutes 39,1 secondes de latitude sud et 41 degrés 43 minutes 46,8 secondes de longitude est, WGS 84.A. 4. Par 10 voix contre 4, décide que, à partir du point où prend fin la frontière dans la mer territoriale, point A, la frontière maritime unique délimitant la zone économique exclusive et le plateau continental en deçà de 200 000 marins entre la République fédérale de Somalie et la République du Kenya suit la ligne géodésique ayant pour azimut initial 114 degrés jusqu'à ce qu'elle atteigne la limite des 200 000 marins mesurée à partir des lignes de base servant à mesurer la largeur de la mer territoriale de la République du Kenya au point situé par 3 degrés 4 minutes 21,3 secondes de latitude sud et 44 degrés 35 minutes 30,7 secondes de longitude est, WGS 84.B. Pour Madame Donoghue, présidente, Monsieur Gevorgian, vice-président, Messieurs Tomka Benuna, Mesdames Shwe Sebutinde, Messieurs Robinson, Iwasawa Nolte, juge, Monsieur Guillaume, juge ad hoc. Contre, Messieurs Abraham, Youssouf, Bandari, Salam, juge. 5. Par 9 voix contre 5, décide que, à partir du point B, la frontière maritime délimitant le plateau continental se poursuit le long de la même ligne géodésique jusqu'à ce qu'elle atteigne la limite extérieure du plateau continental ou la zone où les droits d'État tiers sont susceptibles d'être affectés. Pour Madame Donoghue, présidente, Monsieur Gevorgian, vice-président, Messieurs Tomka Benouna, Mesdames Chouès et Boutinde, Messieurs Iwasawa Nolte, juge, Monsieur Guillaume, juge ad hoc. Contre, Messieurs Abraham, Youssouf, Bandari, Robinson, Salam, juge. 6. À l'unanimité, rejette la demande formulée par la République fédérale de Somalie dans sa conclusion finale numéro 4.
President Donahue appends a separate opinion to the judgment of the court. Judges Abraham and Yusuf append separate opinions to the judgment of the court. Judge Shui appends a declaration to the judgment of the court. Judge Robinson appends an individual partly concurring and partly dissenting opinion to the judgment of the court. Judge Ad hoc Guillaume appends a separate opinion to the judgment of the court. The text of the judgment is available from today in typescript. It will also be available shortly on the court's website. The printed text will be available in the near future. As the court has no other business before it, I declare the sitting closed.
TV.
MMTV.
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 si aad u hesho barnaamijyo tayo leh iyo muuqaalo ku raali geliya ku xidhnow Somali TV YouTube iyo Facebook.
MMTV.
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 Somali TV la yiraahdo Facebookgiisa iyo YouTubekiisa waxaan kala socdaa barnaamijyo kala nooc oo kala duwan oo aad u qiimo badan iyo warar xiiso badan TV-ga Somali TV ku xidhnaada.
culays badan daawade ma ka haysaa helidda warar sugan ma ku dhiban